The rusted gates of Cabanatuan prison camp groaned against their hinges in the humid January air of 1945. The sound had become a death knell for 1,087 American soldiers over the past 3 years and 2 months. Inside those gates, 513 skeletal figures, the last survivors of Bataan and Corregidor, watched Japanese guards frantically burn documents and load supplies onto departing trucks. These men had no idea that exactly 30 miles away, 121 Army Rangers were preparing for the most impossible rescue mission in Pacific War history. No one gets left behind. Stay to discover what these Rangers found when those cursed gates finally swung open for the last time. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Mucci spread a collection of aerial reconnaissance photographs across a makeshift bamboo table in the guerrilla camp deep in the Luzon jungle. The black and white images revealed Cabanatuan's layout in stark, methodical detail. 8 guard towers positioned at precise intervals, triple rows of rusted barbed wire, and long, low barracks that housed what remained of America's finest soldiers. These weren't just photographs, they were death certificates waiting to be signed. The intelligence reports scattered beside the photos painted an even grimmer picture. 3 years and 2 months of systematic starvation had reduced proud American soldiers to walking corpses. Their daily ration consisted of exactly 300 calories, less than a single K-ration breakfast. To put that in perspective, a healthy soldier required 4,500 calories daily for combat operations. These men were receiving less than what a sedentary office worker needed to survive. The death rate inside those walls averaged 2 men every single day. 2 funerals. 2 fewer voices calling for help that would never come. Captain Robert Prince leaned over the photographs, studying every detail through a magnifying glass that had belonged to a dead Japanese officer. The prison compound sat in the middle of vast rice paddies, flat, open terrain stretching for miles in every direction. Any approaching force would be visible from the guard towers long before they reached the perimeter. It was a killing field, designed by military architects who understood that escape was impossible and rescue was suicide. Prince traced potential approach routes with his finger, each path revealing new impossibilities. Japanese records intercepted by Filipino guerrillas indicated approximately 150 enemy soldiers stationed inside the camp itself, but that was just the beginning of their problems. Within a 25-mile radius of Cabanatuan, intelligence estimated another 8,000 Japanese troops, entire battalions positioned at strategic points throughout central Luzon. The Rangers would be outnumbered more than 66-1 in enemy territory. The field clock on Mucci's desk ticked toward 14:15 hours, January 28th. Each tick brought them closer to a deadline that meant death for every American prisoner. Intelligence intercepts from Japanese command headquarters had revealed the unspeakable truth. Rather than allow Allied prisoners to be liberated by advancing American forces, orders had been issued to execute every single POW. Similar commands had already been carried out at Puerto Princesa on Palawan Island, where 150 American prisoners were doused with gasoline and burned alive in underground air raid shelters. The Rangers had perhaps 48 hours before Cabanatuan's prisoners faced the same horrific fate. Captain Juan Pajota, leader of the local guerrilla forces, approached the planning table with maps marking every Japanese position within 50 miles. His fighters controlled key roads and communication lines, but even with their help, moving 121 American Rangers through 30 miles of heavily patrolled enemy territory seemed beyond impossible. The Japanese had learned to fear night operations after months of devastating guerrilla attacks. Sentries now fired at moving shadows. Patrol routes overlapped every 2 hours. Machine gun positions covered every bridge, every crossroads, every potential hiding place. Staff Sergeant Theodore Richardson methodically cleaned his Thompson submachine gun for the 3rd time that day. The weapon had to function perfectly. There would be no second chances, no equipment failures, no margin for error. Around him, Rangers checked ammunition loads with obsessive precision. Each man carried exactly 200 rounds for his primary weapon, plus fragmentation grenades, medical supplies, and emergency rations. They would march light, no heavy equipment, no radio contact once they crossed into enemy territory, no support from artillery or airstrikes. Success depended entirely on three things: speed, surprise, and the unwavering determination that no one gets left behind. The tropical temperature began dropping towards 68 degrees, 20 degrees, as darkness fell across central Luzon. Rangers blackened their faces with charcoal and mud, secured loose equipment with medical tape, and checked every piece of gear that might rattle or reflect light. Captain Prince synchronized watches at exactly 17:45 hours. The march to Cabanatuan would take a minimum of 8 hours through flooded rice paddies, across multiple rivers and past Japanese outposts, where a single careless footstep could trigger alarms that would doom 513 American prisoners to execution. Private First Class Roy Sweezy adjusted his heavy pack and fell into the single-file formation that would carry them through hell. The Rangers moved like ghosts through the darkness, each man maintaining visual contact with the soldier ahead, while staying far enough apart to avoid casualties from enemy fire. Their boots made soft, sucking sounds in the flooded rice fields, unavoidable noise that seemed to echo across the silent landscape. Filipino guides led them along paths invisible to untrained eyes, routes that avoided main roads, sentry positions, and the killing fields where Japanese machine guns could cut them down in seconds. Every 500 yards, the entire column froze in place while scouts crept ahead to check for enemy movement. During these tense minutes, Rangers lay motionless in muddy water, listening for the sound of approaching patrols, the click of rifle bolts, or the whispered Japanese commands that would mean discovery and death. Time crawled past like the sluggish water in the rice paddies. Every second felt like an hour, every breath sounded like a shout that would give away their position. Meanwhile, inside the hellish confines of Cabanatuan prison camp, prisoner medic Captain Jack Schwartz made his evening rounds through barracks that smelled of death, disease, and human desperation. The men lying on bamboo platforms barely qualified as living beings. They were skeletal remnants of soldiers who had once been the pride of the American military. Sergeant James Clem weighed exactly 89 pounds. Down from his enlistment weight of 165 pounds. His arms looked like sticks covered in yellowed skin. His ribs showed clearly through his chest. His legs had lost so much muscle mass that the bones seemed ready to break through the surface. Others had suffered even more devastating physical collapse. Corporal William Hayes weighed 76 pounds. Private Robert Taylor had dropped to 82 pounds. These weren't just numbers, they represented the systematic destruction of human beings through calculated starvation. The Japanese rice ration provided just enough calories to prevent immediate death, but malnutrition diseases claimed lives weekly. Beriberi caused hearts to fail. Dysentery emptied bowels until men died of dehydration. Infected wounds became gangrenous without medical treatment, slowly poisoning blood until fever brought merciful death. The evening meal at Cabanatuan consisted of watery rice soup with occasional scraps of vegetables floating in the gruel. Prisoners received this pathetic ration in battered tin cups that had been used by thousands of men over 3 years. They ate quickly, desperately, before guards could decide to confiscate the food as punishment for some imagined infraction. Some prisoners traded their cigarette rations for extra spoonfuls of rice. Others saved pieces of soap to barter with Filipino civilians, who sometimes managed to slip food through the fence during work details. Every single calorie represented another precious day of survival in a place designed to kill them slowly. Guard Tower Number 3 overlooked the main gate where Sergeant Tsuneo Sugiyama maintained his watch with increasing nervousness. Japanese soldiers throughout the region had grown jumpy as American artillery fire crept steadily closer to the camp. Radio intercepts indicated enemy forces approaching from multiple directions. MacArthur's army was closing the noose around Japanese positions throughout central Luzon. Orders from headquarters remained frustratingly unclear. Evacuate the prisoners to Japan, transfer them to camps deeper in occupied territory, or execute them all before retreating. Sugiyama checked his rifle for the fourth time in an hour, his hands shaking slightly as he wondered what dawn would bring. Coming up, the moment Rangers discovered what 3 years and 2 months of systematic torture had done to America's finest soldiers, and the impossible decision that would haunt them forever. At exactly 1940 hours, Ranger advance scouts crawled into positions 800 yards from Cabanatuan's perimeter fence. Through military binoculars, they counted guard positions and observed patrol patterns with the methodical precision of men whose lives depended on getting every detail correct. The Japanese had maintained their security routine despite increasing pressure from American advances throughout the region. Tower guards changed shifts every 4 hours with military punctuality. Ground patrols circled the entire compound every 90 minutes, following predetermined routes that covered every approach angle. A single dirt road provided the only vehicle access to the camp, a choke point that could be blocked or defended, depending on tactical needs. Captain Prince signaled his platoon leaders forward for final coordination in a whispered conference that would determine whether 513 American prisoners lived or died in the next hour. The assault would commence at exactly 1945 hours, with simultaneous diversionary attacks on both flanks of the compound. Filipino guerrillas would cut telephone lines connecting the camp to Japanese headquarters and establish roadblocks to prevent enemy reinforcements from reaching the battle. Rangers would breach the main gate, while assault teams eliminated guard towers and secured the prisoner barracks. The entire operation had to conclude within 30 minutes, before Japanese reserve forces could mobilize and surround the rescue force. Private Lester Mokino crawled through tall grass toward the eastern guard tower, his Springfield rifle loaded with a single round chambered for the shot that would begin the battle. Beside him, Corporal Roy Peters prepared to eliminate the tower's machine gun position with a fragmentation grenade. They could see the Japanese sentry's cigarette glowing in the darkness like a target beacon. The soldier, completely unaware that American Rangers lay 50 yards away with weapons trained on his position. Peters checked his watch one final time. 1942 hours. 3 minutes until hell erupted across the prison compound. Inside the prisoner barracks, Lieutenant Colonel Edward King struggled to maintain morale among fellow survivors who had given up hope months ago. King carried a terrible burden. He had commanded the surrender of Bataan on April 9, 1942, handing over 76,000 American and Filipino soldiers to Japanese captivity. That decision had haunted him through 34 months of brutal imprisonment. Around him, men whispered about the distant rumble of artillery fire and increased Japanese activity throughout the camp. Some dared hope that liberation might actually come before their failing bodies gave out completely. Others had learned that hope was more dangerous than despair. Prisoner John Cook had developed an intricate calendar system using scratches carved into the wooden wall beside his sleeping platform. By his meticulous count, they had survived exactly 1,156 days of captivity. 156 mornings of waking up hungry, 156 nights of falling asleep hungry, 156 days of watching friends die from starvation and disease. Each tiny mark represented 24 hours of agony that felt like a lifetime. American forces had landed at Leyte 4 months ago, but liberation still seemed impossibly distant. Cook carved another scratch into the wood and tried to ignore the stomach cramps that never stopped. The prison's medical records, kept with obsessive Japanese bureaucratic precision, documented the systematic destruction of human beings. Of the original 1,600 American prisoners brought to Cabanatuan in 1942, only 513 remained alive. That represented a death rate of 67.9%. More than 2 out of every 3 American soldiers had died in Japanese custody. The causes of death read like a medical textbook of horrors: malnutrition, beriberi, dysentery, malaria, pneumonia, infected wounds, and simple despair that stopped hearts from beating. At precisely 1945 hours, Sergeant Mokino's rifle cracked through the tropical night air like thunder. The Japanese sentry in Tower 3 spun around and collapsed, his cigarette arcing through the darkness like a falling star. Simultaneously, explosions erupted from diversionary attacks on the compound's flanks as Filipino guerrillas detonated charges along nearby roads, and rangers rushed the main gate with weapons blazing. The battle for Cabanatuan had begun. Corporal Francis Shilley led his squad through a gap blown in the perimeter fence by explosive charges that sent twisted metal flying in all directions. Japanese guards stumbled from their quarters, confused by attacks coming from multiple directions simultaneously. Rangers moved with practiced efficiency developed through months of training, clearing bunkers and guard positions with Thompson submachine guns and Bar automatic rifles that spat death at 500 rounds per minute. Tracer rounds illuminated the compound in deadly streaks of red and orange light that turned night into a vision of hell. Sergeant James Richardson kicked open the door to Barracks Number 6 with such force that the hinges shattered. Inside, skeletal figures cowered on bamboo platforms, unsure whether their supposed rescuers were American soldiers or Japanese guards coming to execute them. These men had learned that loud noises usually meant death. "We're Rangers!" Richardson shouted over the gunfire. "American Rangers! You're going home tonight!" The prisoners stared in disbelief, their sunken eyes wide with shock. Some began weeping openly, the first tears of joy they had shed in over 3 years. Others remained silent, too traumatized to believe that rescue was actually possible. 3 years and 2 months of captivity had taught them that hope was the cruelest torture of all. No one gets left behind. But they had been left behind for 1,156 endless days and nights. Captain Prince's assault team secured the Japanese commandant's quarters within 8 minutes of the initial breach, finding documents that would haunt American military leadership for decades. Japanese resistance crumbled as surprise attacks from multiple directions overwhelmed defensive positions designed to repel attacks from a single direction. Rangers discovered written orders indicating plans to execute all prisoners at dawn, execution by beheading, followed by burning the bodies to destroy evidence of war crimes. The timing had been perfect, with a margin measured in hours, not days. Medical corpsman Alvin Powlett began emergency triage on liberated prisoners, and what he found shocked even combat medics who had seen the worst of Pacific War casualties. These weren't wounded soldiers. They were living corpses who somehow still breathed. Men who had enlisted at robust weights of 180 pounds now weighed 95 pounds or less. Sergeant William Nellist couldn't walk unassisted because his legs had lost so much muscle mass that bones showed clearly through translucent skin. Others suffered from advanced beriberi that made their hearts beat irregularly, dysentery that had destroyed their digestive systems, and infected wounds that had festered for months without any medical treatment. The Rangers discovered meticulous prison records showing the full scope of Japanese war crimes. The original prisoner population of 1,600 Americans had been systematically reduced to 513 survivors through calculated starvation, medical neglect, and outright murder. Disease and malnutrition had killed 1,087 American soldiers, more casualties than most combat units suffered in major battles. Japanese guards had maintained bureaucratic death records with obsessive attention to detail, documenting each prisoner's final days as if recording livestock mortality. Lieutenant William O'Connell supervised the evacuation of prisoners too weakened to walk independently. Filipino guerrillas had positioned ox carts along the planned escape route to carry the most severely debilitated men, but even lifting these skeletal figures onto the carts required extreme care. Many prisoners had bones so fragile from malnutrition that rough handling could cause fractures. Rangers fashioned stretchers from bamboo poles and shelter halves, working with the gentle precision of undertakers preparing bodies for burial. As the rescue column prepared to depart Cabanatuan, freed prisoners encountered their first taste of American abundance in over 3 years, and the culture shock nearly killed them. Rangers shared K-rations containing more food than prisoners had seen in months. Chocolate bars, canned meat, crackers and fruit, luxuries that represented impossible wealth to men accustomed to subsistence on rice water. Men who had survived on 300 calories daily suddenly faced meal portions containing 3,000 calories. Some became violently ill from the richness of real food as their shrunken digestive systems couldn't process normal rations. Former Captain Ralph Rodriguez clutched a Hershey chocolate bar with hands that trembled uncontrollably, not from fear, but from the overwhelming reality of holding more sugar and fat than he had consumed in the past 6 months combined. He had dreamed of chocolate for exactly 1,156 nights, but dreams hadn't prepared him for the actual experience. His stomach, shrunk to the size of a child's fist, could only accommodate tiny nibbles. The simple act of eating candy, once as automatic as breathing, now required careful consideration to avoid digestive shock that could prove fatal. Private Tommy Wilson offered his cigarette ration to a liberated prisoner who stared at the pack of Lucky Strikes as if it contained diamonds. In Cabanatuan, a single cigarette could be traded for a day's worth of extra rice. An entire pack represented wealth beyond imagination. "Take the whole pack," Wilson insisted, pressing the cigarettes into skeletal hands. "We've got plenty more where that came from." The prisoner began crying, not from gratitude, but from the impossibility of comprehending abundance after years of artificial scarcity. The march from Cabanatuan began at 20:15 hours, with rangers carrying or physically supporting prisoners who couldn't walk independently after 3 years of systematic starvation. Filipino guides led them along different routes than the approach march to avoid Japanese patrols that were mobilizing in response to the attack. Every 800 yards, the column halted while the weakest prisoners rested and medics checked for signs of cardiovascular collapse. Some men had to be carried the entire 30-mile distance to American lines because their legs simply couldn't support their body weight. Staff Sergeant Theodore Richardson monitored radio frequencies for Japanese response activity while the rescue column moved through the darkness. Enemy units were converging on Cabanatuan from 3 directions, but coordination appeared chaotic and confused. The surprise attack had disrupted communications sufficiently to delay organized pursuit, but Japanese commanders were issuing increasingly frantic orders to locate and destroy the American rescue force. Rangers had perhaps a 6-hour lead before enemy forces could mount effective search and destroy operations. During mandatory rest halts, liberated prisoners shared stories of their captivity with rangers who had risked everything to reach them. The daily routine at Cabanatuan had been designed to break human spirits as efficiently as malnutrition broke human bodies. Reveille at 05 hours sharp, rice ration at 06 hours, exactly 300 calories of watery gruel. Work details from 07 to 18 hours in tropical heat without adequate water. Evening rice soup at 19 hours if prisoners had met their labor quotas. Lights out at 21 hours in barracks that stank of death and human waste. Men who broke rules faced immediate execution or prolonged torture that made death seem merciful. The escape route crossed the Pampanga River at 02:30 hours on January 31st, 1945. Filipino guerrillas had prepared small boats to ferry prisoners across water that moved sluggishly in the tropical darkness. Rangers waded alongside, supporting men who were too weak to climb aboard unassisted and too fragile to risk falling into the water. The river crossing consumed 90 precious minutes. Time lost, while Japanese patrols combed the countryside with increasing desperation to locate the American rescue force before it reached friendly lines. Sergeant Mike Sullivan carried Private Robert Chen across the river because Chen weighed only 84 pounds and lacked the strength to hold himself upright in a boat. Chen had been a champion boxer in his hometown of San Francisco before the war, a muscular 165-pound athlete who could knock out opponents with either hand. Now he felt like a bundle of sticks wrapped in yellowed skin. "Don't worry, buddy," Sullivan whispered as they crossed the dark water. "No one gets left behind. Not tonight. Not ever." At 04:15 hours, the rescue column finally reached American lines near the town of Guimba, where the sight of liberated prisoners shocked hardened combat veterans who thought they had seen everything the war could offer. Medics from the 6th Army immediately began emergency treatment for the most critically ill prisoners, starting intravenous glucose drips to stabilize men suffering from severe malnutrition and dehydration. Others required immediate surgery for infected wounds and gangrenous limbs that had gone untreated for months in Japanese captivity. General Walter Kruger personally met the rescue convoy as it arrived at the American Field Hospital, and the commanding general of the 6th Army, a man who had witnessed some of the most brutal fighting in the Pacific, visibly struggled to maintain his composure when faced with American soldiers who had been systematically destroyed by 3 years of Japanese captivity. The Rangers had marched 61 miles in 72 hours while fighting through enemy territory and carrying men who could barely walk. Not a single prisoner had been left behind. Not a single Ranger had been killed in action. The Cabanatuan raid stood as one of the most successful rescue operations in military history. Intelligence officers began immediate debriefing sessions with liberated prisoners to gather information about conditions inside Japanese prison camps throughout the Philippine Islands. Their testimonies revealed systematic patterns of starvation, medical neglect, and preparation for mass execution of Allied POWs as Japanese forces prepared final defensive lines. Similar camps held thousands of American, British, Australian, and Filipino soldiers across the islands. Time was running critically short to reach them before Japanese retreat orders transformed captivity into wholesale massacre. Dr. Eugene Richardson, Chief Medical Officer for the 6th Army, compiled preliminary medical reports on the rescued prisoners that would later become evidence in war crimes trials. The average weight loss among survivors was 71 pounds per man, representing a 43% reduction in body mass. Malnutrition had caused muscle wasting so severe that many prisoners couldn't perform basic physical functions. Vitamin deficiencies had caused blindness, heart irregularities, and neurological damage. Dental problems from poor nutrition left men unable to chew solid food. The systematic destruction of human beings had been carried out with scientific precision. Private James Murphy, one of the rescued prisoners, tried to explain to a Red Cross interviewer what it felt like to weigh 78 pounds after enlisting at 154 pounds. "You forget what it's like to feel full," he said, in a voice barely above a whisper. "Your stomach hurts all the time, but it's not really hunger anymore. It's just pain that never stops. You dream about food, but the dreams hurt worse than being awake because you know they're not real. When the Rangers gave me that chocolate bar, I thought I was dreaming again. I kept waiting to wake up back in that barracks, but I didn't wake up. This is real. We're really free." The psychological damage inflicted on prisoners proved even more difficult to treat than their physical injuries. 3 years of systematic brutality had taught these men that hope was dangerous, that trust could be fatal, that survival required accepting degradation as normal. Some prisoners couldn't believe the war was nearly over. Others couldn't accept that they would actually be allowed to go home. Many suffered from survivor guilt, wondering why they had lived when 1,087 of their comrades had died in Japanese captivity. Field reports documented specific examples of Japanese cruelty that exceeded the boundaries of military necessity. Prisoners who became too sick to work had their food rations reduced, accelerating their decline toward death. Medical supplies sent by the International Red Cross were routinely confiscated by guards for their own use. Prisoners caught communicating with Filipino civilians were tortured and executed as examples to others. The systematic dehumanization had been deliberate policy, not random brutality. The abandoned prison compound at Cabanatuan told its own story of systematic murder. Mass graves held the remains of hundreds of American soldiers who had died from starvation and disease. Execution posts bore bloodstains from prisoners shot for attempting escape or simply for guards' amusement. Torture chambers contained devices designed specifically to inflict maximum pain without causing immediate death. The Japanese had transformed a military prison into an extermination facility where death came slowly and deliberately. Filipino civilians who had risked their lives to help American prisoners provided additional testimony about Japanese war crimes. Families had been executed for sharing food with starving prisoners. Entire villages had been burned for harboring escaped POWs. Children had been bayoneted for carrying messages between prisoners and guerrilla forces. The Japanese occupation had turned the Philippines into a landscape of terror where humanity became a capital offense. As dawn broke over the American field hospital, liberated prisoners experienced their first sunrise as free men in over 3 years. Many couldn't sleep despite their exhaustion. Freedom felt too fragile to trust, too precious to waste in unconsciousness. They watched American soldiers moving efficiently through their duties, marveled at the abundance of food and medical supplies, and slowly began to believe that their nightmare might actually be over. The rescue of 513 American and Filipino prisoners from Cabanatuan prison camp demonstrated that the U.S. military's creed, "No one gets left behind," wasn't just propaganda, but operational reality. The Rangers had proven that no American would be abandoned, no matter how far behind enemy lines, no matter how impossible the odds, no matter how little time remained before execution. Their success at Cabanatuan inspired similar rescue missions throughout the Pacific as Allied forces raced to liberate prison camps before retreating Japanese forces could carry out mass executions. The prison gates that had sealed 513 men into 3 years and 2 months of systematic torture now swung open to empty barracks and scattered equipment. Japanese documents abandoned in the hasty retreat revealed the full extent of prisoner mortality. 1,087 Americans had died in a camp originally designed to hold them as bargaining chips until war's end. The survivors owed their lives to 121 Rangers who understood that American soldiers don't abandon their own, regardless of the cost, regardless of the danger, regardless of orders that might suggest otherwise. Those same rusted gates that had groaned shut on healthy, proud soldiers in April 1942 now witnessed their return as skeletal survivors, carried to freedom by Rangers who proved that some promises are worth dying to keep. No one gets left behind, not in life, not in death, not ever. The morning sun illuminated faces that had forgotten how to smile, but were learning to hope again. Freedom tasted like chocolate and felt like the strong arms of fellow soldiers who had crossed 30 miles of enemy territory to honor a simple promise: no one gets left behind. FIM.